Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Emma Rebellato. I'm really delighted to welcome you to the final conference session. You've almost made it. So this is, of course, where to from here for the Australian homelessness system. I'd first like to acknowledge that this land we meet on today is the traditional lands for the Kaurna people and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. I'd like to thank the host government partner, the Government of South Australia, one of the conference principal partners, along with Business Events Adelaide and the Adelaide Convention Centre for their support for the conference. I'd also like to acknowledge the people who have personal experience of housing vulnerability, who are here either as presenters or as delegates. I know some of you have been to those sessions to hear directly from them, and I know it's already had a big impact. It's your experiences, your insights that play a really vital role in shaping better housing outcomes for the future. Also, thank you to Mission Australia, who's the sponsored delegate partner. Well, thank you for joining us here. This is, as I mentioned, the final session of the conference. I know it has been a jam-packed couple of days, full of great discussions, research, ideas, best practice. And now, with our speakers this afternoon, it's the chance to reflect on all of that. Also to look ahead as to what's next. How do we look forward? What are the key opportunities for the homelessness service systems for national policy? How does everyone work together to improve the lives of all Australians? What's the priority? And what is everyone hoping for out of the National Housing and Homelessness Plan? There's a lot to get through. So please join me in welcoming our panel members who'll bring different perspectives to this discussion. I'd like to welcome Rachel Hunter, who's the independent reviewer into Queensland homelessness responses. Also Deb Buckskin, Senior Advisor for Aboriginal Services for Baptist Care SA, also the Director of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Housing Association. Welcome to Dom Rowe, CEO of Homelessness New South Wales, and John Engeler, Chair of National Shelter and CEO of Shelter New South Wales. Now, as I mentioned, they all come to us with very different perspectives and different experiences, and for more information on their bios, you can check the conference portal. Now, we will be opening the floor to questions a bit later as well. Now, as you think about what you'd like to ask, I'd like to ask that you keep those questions short and succinct, because we really just want to keep the conversation going. So we're going to hear from everyone on their thoughts of what they've heard so far at the conference. Then we'll look ahead to the future. As I said, a lot to get through. And panel members, a warning, I might have to give some of you the wind up. John, I'm looking at you. First, I'm going to ask Deb Buckskin to come up because she's got a few things that she wants to say.
I shouldn't be nervous really, should I? So Nankia Mena, Yukanandalia Yakanandalia, Nanari Deb Katanya Buckskin, Natawangandi Ghana Naranga, Wurungu Nongkai, Marawachanga Ghana Mena, Mani Napudni Ghana Yatana Wangandi, Natalia. I'm Deb Buckskin. I'm the firstborn female in my family. I am Ghana, I'm Naranga, I am Wurungu, and this is Ghana country and has been since the first sunrise. I'd like to acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I want to firstly apologise because thanks to Alex Reid, I know you're in the room, I fried my laptop yesterday, and my very well prepared speech and presentation was, I'm sure, much better last night than it was rewriting it today, so I'm really, really sorry. And I'd also like to just say that I don't speak for all Aboriginal people. I can only give my opinion on what I've seen and what my observations have been. I wanted to address firstly cultural protocol and respect, and that's something that you'll probably hear a lot of around the nation. But as Aboriginal people in South Australia, we identify as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. We don't identify as First Nations or Indigenous, And I think if we're going to, and firstly, we also identify by our language group or our country. We're Ghana, we're Irrawong, we're Admatna. So I think it's, when you're working on country and in country with people, it's very respectful to reach out and actually ask the people from the country that you're working on how they would like to be addressed or be spoken to. And I think if you work in procurement at either state or federal level, I'd like to see you work with communities locally to prepare funding agreements and use language that truly reflects and represents the people that those funding agreements are working for. So over the last 2 days, we've heard from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders from across the country and sector. And I don't want to go over what they've said, but I do encourage you to watch those sessions again, learn from what they've said, and practice te diri, the deep listening, reflect, and really try and understand the message that those Aboriginal leaders have tried to share with each and every one of us across the last 2 days. The Closing the Gap message around Priority Reform 2 and 4 were quite powerful over the last 2 days. I think government and the wider NGO service confuse from a cultural lens what capacity building actually means. Some echoes are strong and they have a sustained infrastructure. They have strategically and operationally strong and amazing. Other echoes are younger and have only recently been incorporated. But what they do well, all of them collectively, and what they're more than capable of providing is a culturally responsive, strength-based service to our mob and communities. Just because they don't have tender writers or in-house finance and human resources, it doesn't lessen their ability to achieve outcomes as well as any other service in this room. They're more than capable of standing on point and delivering black services to black people. Ultimately, what we want to see achieved through Priority Reform 2 is Aboriginal community-controlled organisations being able to compete with mainstream services for mainstream funding, and not money that is significantly less and ring-fenced for Aboriginal service delivery. Another topic was Priority Reform 4, and we heard a lot about data sharing and data sovereignty over the last 2 days. If Aboriginal people had ownership and oversight of all data impacting housing and homelessness, and services were developed and designed by Aboriginal people, it would greatly benefit the sector and our communities. We should see change that we would have service models designed by local people that would have long-lasting impacts and build strong, re-empowered communities. I've recently learnt about empowerment and re-empowerment on a trip to the United Nations, and one of the lawyers over there said to me, "Why are Aboriginal people continuing to say empowered? You had power, it was taken from you. You want to re-empower your community." So that's language that I want to see us utilise in this sector as well. And I'd also like to see self-reporting changed. Anyone receiving Aboriginal funding must be audited by Aboriginal services. This process would hold services to account and would be honest, open and transparent. Through data, language can be powerful and meaningful. Being able to change the stigma of what community and social housing looks and feels like is important. Living in community and social housing is a lived experience and can only strengthen and develop our sector, our boards and our workplace and our workforce. And another word that I heard, and I quite often use this in South Australia, is the word cohort. I'm not a cohort, I'm an Aboriginal person. And I think that's another form of language that I'd like to see changed, because we're Aboriginal people and communities, we're not a cohort. We're LGBTQI plus communities, we're young people, we're women and children. We're not cohorts. I just find that word uncomfortable. So I've thought about it and how do I safely agitate and challenge people to change moving forwards and maintain relationships and keep open and trusting relationships intact. And there's been a number of topics that have stood out for me that I'd like to speak to. System reform. We all agree that it needs to happen to enact change. That's a given. But we need brave leaders who are willing not to just flip the narrative, but drive systems that have failed and continue to fail Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We have decades of policies and systemic inequalities that has disrupted and continue to oppress our communities. We cannot simply keep doing the same thing. We must look at the current housing and homelessness system as a colonised construct and allow Aboriginal people true self-determination to lead us in what secure and safe housing looks like. We need Aboriginal people and communities where we need to meet Aboriginal people and communities where they are and not where the service thinks they need them to be. What works in the Northern Territory might not work in New South Wales, and what you need to do collectively is work locally on the ground with the people from that country and determine what is the best outcomes and priorities for people in those local areas. And another thing I kind of picked up over the last couple of days was if an Aboriginal person is sleeping rough under a tree in Whitmore Square, here in the CBD, and another Aboriginal person is sleeping rough under a tree in Pipalajara, the difference comes down to visibility. What makes non-Aboriginal people uncomfortable in someone seeing someone sleep rough? It causes frustration and embarrassment to non-Aboriginal people. But if you speak to that Aboriginal person and ask them about sleeping rough and why you're homeless, 9 times out of 10 they'll say, how can I be homeless in my own country? And that's, I think, truly something that can be reflected around the whole country. It's about non-Aboriginal people's uncomfortability around what homelessness and housing looks like. And I think we need to change that narrative. Overcrowding was another thing that we discussed a lot in our lead up to this conversation, and I've heard it over and over again, especially over the last 2 days. And what government and service providers see as a deficit and as an issue, Aboriginal people see as a strength and form of comfort and a sense of what feels like home. What the word overcrowding does is allows government and services to weaponise how they work with Aboriginal people. It's an outcome they often use to suit their narrative or achieve an outcome that they want to see achieved. You have 10 people in a 3-bedroom house. Oh, we need to report that to the Housing Trust and have you evicted. You're sleeping rough in your car with your child. We need to report that to DCP and have your children removed. We have mandatory reporting legislation that gives no room for looking at what is happening for those families and how living together is supporting and keeping families together. Or the mother that's sleeping in that car with her child is actually there protecting that child from the domestic violence that she's trying to escape. So instead of supporting these families, we are weaponising systems to cause more damage. This is not okay, and the system is failing us by continuing to doing what we're doing. Co-design. Here's a thought. So rather than systems and policies that have progressed from consultation and collaboration, we're now moving into co-designing with Aboriginal people and communities and Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. How about we just let Aboriginal people sit down around the table and design the services that work for us, by us? For too long as Aboriginal people, we've heard, you aren't ready. You aren't capable of designing models of practice excellence that actually work, that are trauma-informed, are strength-based, are person-centred and restorative. And we've heard it over and over again over the years. But I've seen and heard from my mob, especially over the last 2 days, and we're more than ready and we're more than capable. I'd like to see us skip the co-design model and move to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led, owned and managed systems. We create far greater public value with cost of doing business in ACOs, costing far less than that of a government-led model. You get more culturally responsive way of doing business. You build local sustainable industries in the process. We need to stop funneling public money through systems that continue to fail to address these wicked problems and invest in new systems which push past the existing frameworks and structures. We need a dedicated national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing and homelessness plan, led by community and adopted by all governments. We need long-term funding commitments protected by legislation and backed by bipartisan support. The last word that I continued to have heard over the last couple of days was I'm an ally. And I really, really struggle with this word. And because being an ally often comes with conditions of support or have some emotion attached to it. And being an ally goes to the depth of your comfortability in what you're being an ally for. And I don't want an ally, I want an accomplice. I want someone here right next to me as an equal partner. I want you to use your privilege to enact and encourage change, and that we can continue to work together, and in fact that should be our goal that we should try to reach. So thank you.
Thank you, Deb. Okay, so we're now going to discuss with some of the others some of the key things that they got out of the last couple of days, and perhaps some words which we shouldn't be using as well. I don't know. Dom, let's start with you with some of the key things that you've heard out of the conference so far, and some of the things that you think maybe we can use towards the future.
Yeah, firstly, I just want to thank Deb because I really like the idea of being an accomplice. Yeah. I think that is a little bit naughtier and a little bit more helpful than sometimes the phrase ally. So I just want to say I really appreciate you adding that little insight amongst other insights. I hope that I can be an accomplice in the future. This conference has been pretty amazing. I think there's what's happened in the sessions and there's what's happened outside the sessions. I just want to recognise that one of the things outside the sessions that's happened is that this sector has shown how relational it is and how connected it is. And there's actually a lot of power and influence in that. And so that's one of the things I've learned. I've met quite a lot of new people who've challenged my thinking, and just really want to appreciate those people in the room, or those of you that are still here. We've heard a lot in the conference about data and evidence, and what I've really appreciated is that always hasn't been a heavy sort of extraction of data and evidence, but recognising that many of us are delivering frontline services and need data and evidence that helps us build and improve our practice. And we've heard a number of presentations about that over the last couple of days. I've appreciated too, sometimes I wonder if our sector focuses too much on outputs. This is how many people we helped in our service. This is how many meals we delivered. But what I've heard at this conference has been something that's made me quite thankful, and something I think we need to do more as a movement, and that's a focus on outcomes rather than outputs. So actually talking about our impact, our real world impact, looking at how many people we've been able to help into housing, looking at how many people whose health conditions are lesser because of our work. So I just think that has been really nice to see in the conference. I've also heard a lot of people with lived experience intersecting in the conference, and that's not always the case in our conferences. We sometimes, dare I say it, pay lip service to lived experience. And I want to do a shout out to those people with lived experience of homelessness that have shouted out, and particularly those people that have asked questions, and slightly spiky questions in the sessions, because I think there's been a lot of gold that's come out from people with lived experience in that way. But on the sessions as well, but particularly for those of you that were a part of the audience, I think you've played a bigger role than what many of us have played in the conference. And the final thing, and I really appreciated Deb talking, because one of the some of the best sessions for me were actually around Aboriginal-led work practice organisations, cultural sensitivity and how we do that. And in one of the sessions, there was a moment where I went, I've got to take that back to the organisation I'm in. And that was, if you're a mainstream organisation that's got an Aboriginal workforce, why don't you think about how to set up or help that group of workers set up an Aboriginal organisation? And that for me really spoke to me, because my organisation has at this stage only one Aboriginal worker, but there's clearly room for more. And so how might I, as a accomplice, help that organisation or that nascent organisation start to have more influence in New South Wales? So those were a few of my takeaways from the conference. Many more than that, but those were the sort of big ones for me.
Rachel, what about you when you look at what's been discussed and how to, I guess, take that back to Queensland, because Queensland's a pretty unique state compared to other states in terms of population and regionally. What are some of the things that you've heard or that your colleagues have told you about that you think could be applied?
Thanks, Emma. We're undertaking, as Emma said, a review into the response into homelessness in Queensland, and certainly some of the things I've heard today reinforce the need for us to think about system redesign and system integration. I think they've been pretty pervasive themes in the discussions that I've certainly heard today. Some of the principles that we have extracted through quite extensive consultation across Queensland over the last 4 months go to things like the importance of access and equity. So we have 126 publicly funded specialist homelessness services with a reach right across Queensland. And as Emma said, Queensland is a unique state in so many ways. But if we talk about it being unique in terms of its population reach outside the concentrated southeast corner, there are many regions that have quite diversified needs in terms of responses to homeless people living in those urban regional centres or living regionally and in remote centres. So how do you design a system that provides the equitable reach of services to very vulnerable populations living in various regions and remotely in Queensland? That's always a challenge. It's a challenge in every sector, whether it's in terms of response to homelessness or education or health. There are huge challenges servicing a state like ours. I think system integration, I've heard a lot of discussion about the strength of the relational system that binds people who work in specialist homelessness services. I think we've got work to do around the relationship between the sector and government as a funder, and we're certainly moving to a model which is really a partnership model, which is a model based on co-design principles. We're certainly moving to propose a system that draws heavily on evidence, but also on the strength of relational networks right across the sector, into government, and importantly across government. I'm a long-term public servant. I fully understand the challenges of getting agencies to work across their own departmental boundaries, and there are all sorts of reasons why that's difficult, but I always say the greatest challenge is the cultural challenge. And what we have at the moment, I think, is such an impetus for change. We have huge social licence around the need for government to work with the sector to respond to our most vulnerable people. And I think social licence is something that comes and goes, and so we really have to grasp the opportunity. I can talk more about system design. The major elements for us are around governance, and getting that integration across agencies and out into the sector, the importance of the voice of people with lived experience. We've spoken to many people who are living in either with the risk of becoming homeless or who are actually homeless, and their deep experience and painful experience in many cases is one that will need to shape future system responses. Housing supply and affordability is a major issue, and it's not an issue, as I heard the discussion today, that's going to be resolved easily. But what we can't allow the system to do is to become trapped in that state of crisis response. So I think being able to move while offering temporary emergency crisis accommodation, having an eye to how we progress to build fit for purpose, affordable and supportive housing moving forward. Queensland's just injecting $3.1 billion into housing construction over up to 2046. So money has become less of the issue, but planning and designing fit-for-purpose homes for vulnerable Queenslanders is a priority. And the final thing, of course, in terms of system design, goes to service design and support, and how we ensure that we provide equitable services focused primarily on prevention, early intervention, so people don't fall into a situation where they're at risk of becoming homeless.
John, I'll ask you, you look at this from a state and a national perspective with your roles. Mm-hmm. What are some of the key things that you've heard, the main observations, or anything that's really surprised you that you've heard over the last couple of days?
Yeah, I'm going to riff off Deb here and...
Should we set the timer?
No, we'll be right. Go. I'm going to riff off Deb here and talk about I think it's Didiri, I think that's the word, about the deep listening. So I think one thing that I'll absolutely be touching on is just this concept of severe overcrowding and overcrowding generally. And I actually think what we've done really well at this conference is show the cultural way in which certain rural and remote Aboriginal communities might experience overcrowding or severe overcrowding. And there's a particular census definition that goes with this, and I'll come back to that and why it's important. But that's a very different discussion to your point about what happens in metropolitan and urban areas. So I'm actually thinking I've heard a lot from Neil, from Paul Coe, who's actually director of my own organisation, Shelter, CEO of Birraby. Some really good insights about how we understand but should not explain away culturally severe overcrowding at a national level. So that's one thing. Mm-hmm. One thing that I am bedeviled by is the way in which we in New South Wales account for. So we've all got this figure that we use, 122,494 people were considered homeless by the last ABS census, made up of 6 categories. We understand generally the first 5 categories. Most of us in the room deal day to day with it. The 6th category, which I think COVID gave us the opportunity to talk about in a way that we never did. We dealt with the urgent, if you like, of rough sleeping and boarding houses and people in temporary accommodation and couch surfing. We've always left as sort of, well, that's too hard to explain, or we don't quite get it. It's important, but it's not urgent. It's chronic, not acute, is severe overcrowding. And by severe overcrowding, we mean 8 people in a 2-bedroom unit. The reason why I like to bring it up and think that this conference is a great opportunity to talk about is a couple of things. It is actually a socio-spatial problem. In other words, it can be mapped, seen from above, and it tends to exist, certainly in the case of New South Wales, just looking at the stats. So of that 122,000, big number, 15,000 people in the country live in severe overcrowded dwellings in 4 local government areas in Sydney, and they are usually 8 people in a 2-bedroom unit, often newly arrived, often renting. There's 4 cultural groups that they tend to represent, people from India, China, Vietnam. There's a couple of other groups that form, but it's actually known, quantifiable, and to that end, I actually think addressable. But I think for too long, and again, COVID, I think, gave us the opportunity to recalibrate. We shouldn't lose that. The opportunity to say, well, what could we do about that particular area? Because I think, I know, just looking at the stats, we literally could encourage state government in New South Wales, for example, if they built about 3,000 more dwellings or added 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms or 4 bedrooms onto some existing dwellings that we have, we could go a long way to resolving it, if not solving it. So I think that's been the big learning for me. I'm really pleased at the way in which severe overcrowding has been given the airing that it needed to, and the sensitivity around, yes, it's a choice, but let's not explain away something as being culturally okay when in fact it's option B or C or D. If you give people choice, it may not be that. But certainly there's an opportunity, and I think any doubts we had about this, and I've spoken to Michael about this, the executive of Huri, I think we saw that our colleagues both in the States and in Canada, and somewhat ironically because we do use a Canadian definition of over-occupancy as our rule in the ABS census, but they don't clearly count, in the figures that we saw yesterday from Canada and the US, they don't consider severe overcrowding to be part of the homelessness figure. Mm-hmm. So that's probably the biggest learning for me. I can take that back to New South Wales. It's addressable. We can see the numbers. I think we can do a lot more in that area.
Let's keep looking towards the future and possible solutions, how we shake things up, where we can see some change. Dom, let's start with you, because you come into this with fairly fresh eyes. So you've been with Homelessness New South Wales for about 8 months or so. You've come with different executive roles behind you. But coming at this with fresh eyes, what are some of the things that you think are the greatest opportunities for change in New South Wales or nationally?
I love that question because it's a big question. And
I don't ask small questions.
no, let's not waste time.
No, let's get into it.
You know, I think there's actually some really great opportunities for this sector that are untapped. My personal view is that we need to be aiming, dare I say it, larger and bolder. I think a lot of us have become used to losing, and losing in a political sense. And so, for example, I'm not happy with $6.1 billion in New South Wales because I don't think it's going to fix the problem. I'm not happy with 3.1 in Queensland because I don't think it's going to fix the problem. And I think all of us here are mission aligned. We all want to end homelessness. And if we're serious about ending homelessness, that means we need to ratchet up the ambition. But at the same time as ratcheting up the ambition, we need to develop a little bit more power. And this sector doesn't talk about power so much. It talks about the symptoms of power. So it talks about what has happened to First Nations people. It talks about what happens to lived experience people. But it doesn't talk about how we build more power to change the system that we exist in. And at the moment, we've got political leaders that are sort of starting to listen, but just not enough. We need multi-billion-dollar amounts that will deliver social housing so that we don't need to have at this conference a session where we go, what do you do when there's no housing options? Like, that's soul destroying for the people that are mission focused. And many of us know that, right? It's soul destroying. But actually, we have some power. And the power we've got is, we've got a mission where we're actually values aligned, which we can develop partnerships and work together. We're in contact with the public on a regular basis. You know, the public has, I think, at its heart, does believe that housing should be a right. It's just we need to unlock that and turn that towards politics to get us the money that we need. And I think it means, by the way, social housing, more social housing and more funding for homelessness services so that people have wraparound supports and can have the support they need once they get a home. And that is a safe and secure home. So I think that we can get the public on board. I then think that we can start placing pressure on politicians. I know this might sound twee, but I want you all to think about what politicians would do if homelessness services decided to withdraw their labour for 3 days, and what that would mean to our community. People would feel the difference. And that actually is a source of power, but it means we need ambition and we need to work together to start placing that pressure. At the moment, in my previous work, we talked about a way of talking about power, and it was once you get into the decision maker's room, do you find yourself at the table or do you find yourself on the menu? And at the moment, this sector is on the menu. And we need to change that, and I think we can do that together. It's why conferences like these are absolutely important. They might cost a lot of money, but they're the beginning of a movement where we can cohere and start talking about collective solutions. I don't want to let our political masters get off the hook for any longer. Many people have said to me at this conference, this is the same thing we were talking about 10 years ago. I'm sure a few of you have heard that. And the reason why it's the same thing we were talking about 10 years ago is because we haven't developed the power to change the system. So that might be my slightly provocative, I'm not sure how the rest of my colleagues will feel about that.
I think it sounds like you're a big accomplice right there, that's what I think.
I think what scares me the most is that if non-Aboriginal people don't feel powered or powerful, my worry for Aboriginal people in this sector is I'm just more disheartened because we're even lower down the empowerment kind of ladder already, and I just worry that if you're feeling like that, the rest of the sector, in the cold, the LGBTQ youth, like other people who are in those really extremely vulnerable positions, it's even more challenging to try and re-empower, and it worries me.
We have mentioned, Rachel, I think it was you, that there seems to be an appetite for change. And I think in part it's because I think in general we are talking about housing more, the rental crisis, the cost of living. Yeah. And I think more people are seeing that so many more Australians are at risk of homelessness now than ever before. People who have jobs, people who are educated.
Double income.
Yeah, families. Double income, exactly. So if we have this appetite for change, what are you hoping for out of our leaders now, particularly because we are about to see the National Housing and Homelessness Plan? I'll get each of you to answer. Let's keep it short, sharp and shiny as a bit of a message for the Q&A section in a tick. I'll go start at the other end. John, what are you hoping for out of this, and do you think it's going to happen?
I do, and two things. I think gone are the days where we can dismiss renters, for example. Gone are the days where we can think of government's response, particularly at the national level, as being only because it's after the war or because there's an economic crisis or there's a health crisis. I think it's been significant and probably somewhat not given the kudos it needed to, but the government pushing through to get a particular mechanism set up, the HAF, that is actually a fund, not big enough, not producing enough, and it's got to be borrowed from somewhere else. We'd like to see an actual sovereign fund that's there and outlasts the political cycle. So again, it's money that's committed for housing. It's such a critical national issue, and the money should be kept there in the piggy bank. Sure, we use the interest, but I think that's probably what I'd like to see from the plan. Just at the other end of the room, just to be, again, hopeful, I've been really enamoured by the way in which local governments increasingly say, you know what, there's lots we can do here. And the conference has had a few sessions on it. I've been delighted meeting with a number of people from councils all over the country saying, actually, we're not just going to say, well, that's a federal government funding issue or a state government operational issue. There's things we can do now in our local government area because our communities want us to do that. So where Dom and I are in the inner west of Sydney, we know there's some great things that are already happening. The Inner West Council all of a sudden wants to do a lot more, not just in affordable housing for key workers. You know, they actually want to do some social housing and absolutely roll up their sleeves and see what they can do around homelessness. So that's a good thing.
And Deb, what are you hoping for out of the national plan?
I actually want to see someone be bold and brave.
Yeah,
and I'll give an
for it.
example. A few years ago during COVID, we had obviously Engeler women and children and men sleeping rough in the Adelaide CBD who couldn't sleep rough due to the lockdowns. And we had a CEO of DHS and her executive team be so bold and so brave, and they could have professionally fallen on a sword that destroyed their careers. But they didn't, and they chose to work with Aboriginal people and communities, especially Engeler and Kaurna people, around a really different system of support during that COVID period that everyone was so scared of, but they drove forward with it, and they continue to drive forward with it, and they're continuing to drive change in that space. And I am so proud of the braveness that they were, as women, were willing to take a political fall for and a risk and at their own reputation and damage it, and they didn't, and they came out successful because they did it the right way. They worked with Aboriginal people and communities, they worked with Engeler, they worked with Kaurna, they every single day had cultural meetings set up to make sure that safety and risk and working with health and education and DCP and like bringing removing the silos and bringing everyone in together to create this great change or opportunity to show something really, really different. And I know that's really minimalistic compared to what you're kind of asking, but that's what I want to see, that level of braveness and that level of boldness and be willing to die on that sword.
Rachel, you're obviously looking at the Queensland system. Out of the national plan, I know better coordination is being looked at and all the different sectors are being looked at as part of this. Do you think there needs to be a better leadership at the national level or better coordination? Because you're obviously looking at it from Queensland's level. So how do you think the plan could go, and how do you think it should go?
I mean, this is an issue that is impacting nationally. Every jurisdiction is dealing with the consequences of housing supply, unaffordability, the rental squeeze, cost of living, and all of that is adding to the pressures that are driving more and more people into homelessness. So it's a national issue. I anticipate a national plan that is bold, that is ambitious, and that draws a line, if you like, around what is acceptable in Australia. It is not acceptable in Australia to have people forced from their homes, families living in cars, women and children escaping domestic and family violence, children, young people for whom there are very few service options, sleeping rough. So that is not acceptable in this country. And so I expect a national plan to articulate its ambition in terms of not only a roof over everyone's head, but importantly for some people, the breadth and touch of services that they require in order to sustain tenancies or to sustain that roof over their head. For some people, it's very light touch. For others, it's lifelong care. So that's what I expect.
Constitutional human right, to be housed in this country, I think is the boundary that we should be setting. That should be the basic bare minimum.
John, what about you? I mean, you've pretty much thrown a challenge to our political leaders already. What are you hoping for out of the national plan? Do you think it will meet your aims, your hopes, expectations?
I think we're going to have to do a lot of work to get it there. I think I agree with Deb that it's got to have in it that housing is a human right. I think that will actually push things in the right direction. I think it needs clear and measurable targets. It's interesting, they've already decided the resourcing. So it's kind of interesting doing the plan after you've decided the resourcing, but maybe we can revisit that. And, in terms of those clear and measurable targets, I think in this round of the plan, it should be 1 in 20 homes are social homes, and we should double the amount of homelessness service funding. I think at the moment it's inadequate, as you would probably realise. But I also think there's some principles that would be good to include in the national plan. One of those is that service should be, or practice should be, people-centred, so the systems become people-centred. They're quite bureaucratic at the moment. People have to navigate a very complex system, and I think the easier we can make that journey of people through a pretty traumatic situation, the better. So I'd love to see something about that in the national plan. I think when we look at our First Nations colleagues and the level of homelessness that a person who's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander might experience, I think actually we need to do a lot of work on cultural safety and self-determination in the homelessness system, and I think we can do that in the 5 years that we've got. I think we can make some real steps in the right direction. So I'd be interested in that. And then the next thing I think that we can still do some more work on, it's one of the lessons from the conference actually, is more evidence-based policy and practice. How do we actually get that baked into the system? Because I think there's some room to move there. But it's going to be an interesting dance, as I said. Having the resources decided before we've actually written the plan is interesting.
I think something we talked about earlier when we had a bit of a conference catch-up earlier was South Australia has a unique alliance model, and it's been in place for a few years now. How do you think that compares to what else is going on, Deb? Do you reckon that others need to look at that and go, okay, we need to go this way or improve on it, learn from it, and let's...
I'm extremely patriotic towards South Australia, and I think what we're doing here is brave and bold, and the people that are working within the alliance model, I take my hat off to them every single day. They are willing to create a model of practice that is so good that it should be modelled around the country and around the world. And it was the lady, I'm sorry, I forgot, is it Janine, the first lady that spoke on the first day? A couple of the things she said, she talked around divert and a couple of things she mentioned, I was like, we're doing that in South Australia. Why are we bringing an American over when we're doing that here? So I was sitting up the back going, hang on, we're doing that. Like, let's praise our own lot. But what I love about the alliance model is accountability and transparency. And you can't hide when you're in an alliance. And when you've got a team of 7 or 8 services providing a service to everyone, if one of you fail, all of you fail. So I love I hear a lot that people don't like the alliance model if they're not working in it. And what I get frustrated with is seeing people who get given if there's $16 million for one area in the sector, and you've got $1 million and you've got $1 million and you've got $1 million, and you can self-audit and you can hide behind it, and you can put people on wait lists, and you can design a model that's just not practical, and it's not working for people that are experiencing homelessness. And I love the way that the Towards Home Alliance is developing their model. I love the way that they're giving respect to Aboriginal people and the ability to move funds around and go, oh, you know, LGBTQ, we've got an issue here and we need to move 5% of the funding there, or women and children that are experiencing DV, we need to move 5% of the funding over here, and having people all around the table and having an Aboriginal community controlled organisation that leads the Aboriginal practice in that. I just see so much value in it. I'm proud of it. I think it is a model that should be considered and looked at, and I do hope that people around Australia do reach out to the Towards Home team and find out what they're doing and how they've developed that. And it's not perfect. It's not perfect. It's not a perfect system. But Shaya Nettle is one of the senior managers there. She's an amazing woman who is to the core, salt of the earth, great people who wants to see everyone successful, who wants to see homelessness ended. And I think when we've got people like her at the table with Mel Randell and others that are in South Australia and the Wadliana Aboriginal homeless team, I think it can be achieved, and we can do that if we work together. So.
John, how do you see the future for the sector? Big question, particularly I guess as we're waiting to see this national plan, because that could potentially dictate how things go. But are you seeing that there is this momentum growing, that there is the chance to be bold and bring in new ideas, perhaps some that you've heard at the conference already?
Indeed, and just very generally, I think we've got to concede that at lots of levels of government, state, federal and local, we have a lot of either inaction or going backwards when it comes to sale of properties, all sorts of things. So I think sometimes we draw the distinction between housing and homelessness. I know it's legitimate in certain areas, but other times we do need to concede that we're all part of the same system. So at a federal level, the fact that we do have a government that has a cabinet minister in the cabinet talking about housing is a significant change, and Claire O'Neill, new in the job, is still sitting at the cabinet table. Julie Collins started that off. That is significant, and I think Minister Collins, when she was the Minister for Housing and Homelessness, she's moved across to agriculture and business, she said the previous 10 years, the federal and state ministers got together once in 7 years, whereas I think they've already met 6 or 7 times in the last 2 years. So just that attitude of housing and homelessness needs to be at the cabinet table, not on the menu, and certainly being talked about regularly and listening to the stories, because I've heard so much already from what's happening in other jurisdictions. So the ability for these conferences, they're so important to get together to hear things. The cross-pollination and fertilisation is really important. So to that end, I think we've already got a bit of a culture of let's do this well, let's do this nationally. Yeah. No one's got the absolute monopoly on good ideas.
We're going to open up the floor very shortly, so think of those questions. But I want to ask you about this whole idea of education. Because one of the things in the summary report for the consultation for the plan was talking about that education is needed, not just of the public, but of policymakers too. Just quickly, if we go one by one, do you think people know enough? Are they knowing enough?
I don't think many of the policymakers know enough about lived experience and what it's truly like to face trauma and survive it. And so I think there needs to be education around that. I think actually the public has gone through a massive journey, like a massive education uptake recently. That cost of living crisis we were talking about means that the middle classes in Australia now recognise that there's a real problem, a real challenge in Australia. And that is awful, but also is something that can be harnessed to get quite deep change quite quickly. So I think that education will continue, but policymakers need to do a little bit more work.
Rachel, you've worked in the public service for a long time, and you mentioned the barriers within the public sector as well. But are you starting to see change and people are understanding more, or is that still that battle of education?
I think there's been a tremendous shift in policy making in the public sector over the last 10 plus years, and I think there's far more awareness that good policy is policy that's grounded in lived experience. And certainly there's extensive consultation, both in this space, but more broadly in the social policy space. I think that how that consultation translates into policy shaping and policy influence is something that we need to continue to work on, particularly around influencing political priorities. But Dom's point is absolutely right. There is such an awareness in our community of the housing crisis, the impact that that's having broadly on housing supply, affordability, rents, but also the displacement effect that that's having. And people don't like it. As I said earlier, that it does not resonate with Australians that we have situations where we have vulnerable people sleeping rough, living in cars. So that certainly will create its own political momentum.
Well, I think it's one of those things, it's visibility creates the awareness, but now it's not just someone I see over there, it's my friend, my family member, me, I can't find a rental, I can't pay my bills, I'm struggling here. It's becoming a lot more, I guess, in your face for a lot of people, right? With the Alliance model, have you found that the education's improved because you are all forced to work together as a team, I suppose?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a model of ongoing learning. But from an Aboriginal lens across the country, what I'd like to say is if you're not Aboriginal, you shouldn't have your nose in Aboriginal policy. You shouldn't be designing policies for Aboriginal people if you're not. And I just think that some people need to get out of their own way and understand that there's a place for some people and there's a place that they shouldn't be, and Aboriginal people need to design Aboriginal policy for Aboriginal people. And I think a good example, I think of when you were talking, I was reflecting on, I've watched executive leaders at DHS again get back into grassroots. They are on the ground in South Australia, working, visiting homes. They're working in remote communities in Port Augusta and Ceduna. They are doing outreach services with teams every morning and every afternoon. And I think people that create policy get a better understanding from grassroots service delivery if they're still in it. And I think that's important and valuable. And I think they can bring more to the table if they're not too separated strategically and operationally.
John, your thoughts?
Just on that one, so I had the pleasure last Friday of addressing Reserve Bank of Australia lunch. They take information from people, and it shouldn't have been, but it was a bit of a surprise the extent to which housing precarity can occur in a number of ways. So we normally think about mortgages or rents, but we're finding in our work, just putting a piece of work out now about strata-induced poverty. By that I mean there's a significant proportion of people who might own a unit outright, but if you're on the single age pension in this country and your strata fees are more than $1,500 a quarter, you're paying more than 30% of your low income in housing costs. And I don't know that the Reserve Bank, so policymakers at all ends of the room, including the ones at the shiny end of town, need to understand that that's a cost that's bore somewhere. It might not be in rent or mortgage, but it's a cost that has to be found. So I think absolutely, the more education that has to go across where the costs really hit the ground, that's an operating cost. I think it contributes certainly to the cost of living, like energy and other things. I don't think it gets the weight that it needs, but I think it needs to.
Okay, let's open it up. If you've got a question, raise your hand. We have some volunteers with microphones, the purple T-shirts. They'll come and find you.
If you don't have a question, we can all go to the pub quick.
You're supposed to get them to ask questions, not ask
It's 4 o'clock
questions.
somewhere, right?
Anyone got any questions? They all want to go to the pub too.
Just right up the back here,
Yep,
about halfway
excellent.
up. Jackson from Q Shelter, thank you, panel. Just got a question. It might be for you, John, and could be for the whole panel.
Be the whole panel.
Just picking up on the National Housing and Homelessness Plan, we know, and Don made a great point, that there's been a funding package already delivered with state and territory governments. We know that for 5 years. It's actually essentially the same envelope that we've seen before, except for the increase in the NT. So with the plan, how important is it that industry sees a copy of this plan before it's actually government policy? So that's a question to you, John, or the rest of the panel. I don't think industry's been involved in consultation since about December last year. And so I guess if Claire O'Neill, as the new Federal Housing Minister, was listening, how important is that industry is involved in the next stage?
I'll just briefly say, yeah, it should be on page 1 of the plan, and consulting deeply with organisations like ours, advocacy groups, other people with lived, to quote Greg this morning, not just experience but expertise. I think that's really important. That should be page 1 of any plan, demonstrating that you've done that. And I'll just, before I throw over, contrast that is clearly happening at a state level. So there is a contrast between what I can see not having the deep level of consultation as it needs to with certain groups, peaks and otherwise at the federal level. Certainly in the case of New South Wales, we're very much in the room. There's a few people here from the Homes New South Wales, very much consulting with us almost daily, widely, and saying, tell us what we need to hear, we want to get this right.
Anyone else got any questions? I can see one over there.
Hey, my name's Cam. I work for one of Nimi National's homelessness teams in Sydney. I really loved Dom's points, and particularly the clear call to double funding for homelessness services and just build more housing. And I also loved her call for building power in the sector, and I wondered if she could, and any of the others, expand on that. What does it mean to build power in the sector for organisations, but also as workers in organisations? What does it mean to campaign? Who do we need to identify and target? What does building power and using that power look like for our sector?
Can I just reiterate and just say, the first time I've ever met Dom, and I've got a girl crush. We need more women like her in this sector. She is. I thank you for saying that, because I've just been sitting here going, I need to be quiet and just listen to what she's sharing, because you're amazing.
No, I'm blushing. That's very nice, Deb. The feeling is mutual. Look, I think if you're in New South Wales, which you are, we're going to be having a lot more discussions about how we do this appropriately. One of the things that we need to do is connect across organisations on campaign pushes. There's one at the moment happening where we've got 73 organisations all doing the same thing at the same time, adding their logo to a submission. So trying to subvert the way we do submissions, which sounds small, but is a test to see whether or not we can act collectively. So how do we get people to cross over between organisations, and what's the campaign spaces that we can do that in? There's really low-level sort of tactics that we'll use initially, and you'll be seeing this a lot in New South Wales, and it's called building a list. And all of us have lists, right? You have an email list that you send your newsletter to. That is worth absolute gold when it comes to moving a political message. And so we'll be building lists, and there'll be petitions about a range of things that all of you will be able to get involved in, and you'll be able to share with your networks. And we will get to the stage where, instead of us having each organisation having 500 people on their list, we'll have a group list that's going to have 300,000, 400,000 on it. And then we're going to send that list to political figures to tell them that actually there's a community upswell that's starting to happen around the issues that we're talking about. At the same time, I hope that services will be inviting their local politician to get a little bit of, it's called a coming to Jesus moment, sorry for those of you that are Christian, but inviting them to services and actually educating them about what it means to be on the front lines for the homelessness crisis. And that is a really powerful thing to have happen, because at the moment, our political leaders don't get it. I can tell you now, they just don't get it. They might get a skerrick of it, they might have seen an ABC documentary about it, but they haven't felt it. And they need to feel it, and we need to educate them and place that pressure. Then we'll see where we go. We've got to escalate up. At some point, it will involve some level of protest of organisations in this sector, because you've got to arc up. If we continue to play by the rules of the system as they're currently written, we will continue to lose. So building that collective power, building the number of people in, building the public in, and placing that pressure on politicians is going to make them start to quake. I can bet your bottom dollar if we start to do that 6 months before an election, you'll start seeing some election promises that are actually decent rather than substandard, which is what we're getting at the moment.
Right. I don't think as a sector we quite understand our power and how much we have. And if we remove the silos and focus on our sector strengthening, and I've seen the brilliance that's been in this room over the last couple of days from all across the country. If we are united and collectively stand strong, they can fear us, and they need to fear us. And I think we've got the ability to create that fear, but we're too busy working in our silos, in our own little individual spaces, and not as a collective sector across the country.
Anyone else have any more questions?
Yes,
Yep.
I've got one here. I'm a community representative here, and I'm in a bit of a minority, I think. So the conference has felt like it's industry-based, sector-driven, and a sort of a professional development for folks. And I think if you're looking for building alliances or broadening your base of political support, the community is a representative group that you could invite more, give more access into your events like this, and more access into the discussion. We've tried to join the local alliance and tried to speak to local alliance meetings and put proposals to them. It's been very difficult to do. We've been refused access because we're not a funded agency. We're not part of the institution of the industry or the sector. And just listening to everything, it's fantastic. You're all doing as best you can. It's fantastic. I want to support it all, and particularly the Indigenous speakers, the Aboriginal speakers this 2 days has been just so inspiring. But the community own the homelessness issues in their communities, and I really want to say, how can you invite them in? We do the work of the food handouts. We invite people into our homes to stay and share, couch surf. There's a huge groundswell available to you to add to your political weight if you invite more community people into your forums. Thank you.
Got a question down here?
Thank you. Is that you, John? I'm Eunice.
Hi, Eunice.
Hello, Eunice.
Hello. Look, it's not a question. No more questions. We don't question anymore. We just go and get it. So I just want to say, on behalf of all of us, really thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I thank you, Michael, for staging this conference. I think the 5 of you, including Emma, you arrived late, but you got the glory. This panel, the 5 of you, really second to none, make us go home feeling that really powerful, feeling that we can do it. And I just want to say, on behalf of all of us, we thank you, and thank you, do it again.
Any more questions or comments, perhaps? We've got a couple right at the back, I think, or is that just people waving to say hi and they think we're great too? I don't know.
I'll start by saying hi. Hi, my name's Kelly from the Northern Territory. There was a slide very early on in the conference, and I feel like it was a little bit brushed over. The statistics in the Northern Territory are very high compared to other jurisdictions. And we've been advocating for need case-based funding for some time. As you all know, there's been a recent injection and the plan hasn't come out yet. But my question is for Dom. Dom, if you were to give the Northern Territory sector 3, I don't know, words of encouragement or something to target on for this next funding period with the plan, what would it be?
Ooh.
No pressure.
Tough question.
You know, Kelly, the first thing I want to say is you come from the most beautiful country in Australia, and I know that sounds glib, but that's the first thing that comes to my mind, because I was privileged enough to go up to the Northern Territory and see the land up there, and it's really special. My advice for that money would be, firstly, speak to community. And let community decide how that money is being spent in the Northern Territory. there's really strong communities in the Northern Territory that deserve that respect and know the solutions that fit with their local community. So I wouldn't do it top down, particularly in the Northern Territory. The second thing I'd look at is making sure that there were supplies available to build the types of housing that the community would want, because I assume there'd be some form of housing that they might want to build in their local areas. And the third thing I would ask the community is what kind of infrastructure would they need to have the kind of housing that they want, to make sure that that was available. So sorry, Kelly, that's not the best answer, but for me it would be really based on what the communities of the Northern Territory wanted to see.
I guess that sort of follows on from what Deb was saying about not empowerment but repower. How much should that phrase and that word be used not just on a cultural level but also individual level? How much is that important to change the cycle, to make change in people and families and communities?
I think self-determination and re-empowerment are probably, a lot of people say buzzwords, but when used correctly and when communities have that choice and control and power and control over what is best for their communities, I think it adds so much value, and the outcomes will create a level of dependency and move out of that codependency. It'll move into home ownership, it'll move into generational wealth for Aboriginal communities and families, and I think if we get it right from the ground up around self-determination and re-empowerment and letting Aboriginal people govern and design properties and infrastructure that are suited to their communities, then I think we can't go wrong. I hope we can't go wrong, but I just leave it to, in New South Wales, in Northern Territory, I trust Sky, and I think with the support of Nat Sahar and Zach and the team, I think the Northern Territory, I would like to think that the Northern Territory can really get back. I already think you're amazingly strong communities. My son lives up there and he just loves it, and I just think you have an opportunity for change and growth that you probably haven't been given if you get to govern your own policies and systems.
Any more questions from the floor? Or we've got a couple more at the back. Yep.
Hi, Al Haggerty from First
Up the back, and then we'll go to the front row. Sorry, go on.
Al Haggerty from First National Maitland Real Estate Agent and Real Estate Institute in New South Wales Deputy Chair. I'm going to ask the same question I asked in a breakout yesterday. I'm not part of your group, sector, thank you. And you guys aren't in my sector, but we all fall under the same umbrella of housing. How do we get the two sectors to work better together and get better outcomes for the clients?
I'm happy
John?
to.
Yep.
So one of the stalls, great question, one of the stalls out in the exhibition hall today was about a program which helps tenants understand how they can navigate the process. It's almost like a tenant training scheme, which sounds a bit odd, but it does a really good job. Paul from Queensland runs that. We need a similar thing for landlords, and even the term landlords is loaded, but principled property providers. We often provide the former rental commissioner who was the rental commissioner who was the former head of Homelessness New South Wales, Trina Jones, in New South Wales. We do have a rental commissioner. She talks about the fact that we have roadworthy cars. We need rent-worthy properties. So for your sector, I think landlords, principled property providers, in the same way that you have to register a car, even though it might be on the road, we should have a bit of training and education that helps people. If you're providing an asset that is inevitably going to be classed as a human right response for someone, you probably need certification, training, a certificate, a day of education. I think that would go a long way. So in this country, we do have a lot of mum and dad investors. We use that term pejoratively sometimes. Make us all step up and do the education and the awareness and training. I think that would be a big start.
I like the fact that you're willing to ask the same question as well. And I think the fact that you're asking that question over and over again means something to you. And I think, if you especially get out and work with the peak bodies at a state and national level in your state, building those partnerships and sector strengthening with you at the table is only going to benefit the service
that you want to support. So my advice would be reach out to the peak bodies and build relationships and partnerships with them.
Institute come into this sector?
Sorry, I didn't hear what she said.
Yep, good idea.
What was that?
Sorry, I don't know. I'm already on the Real Estate Institute as the Deputy Chair. How do we bring the Real Estate Institute into this sector and this sector across to us?
Yeah.
There's been a lot of discussion around how the sector networks and strengthens its relational capacity to influence. Dom's point, how do you leverage that capacity to influence at a political level? I think we need to be talking about how we also influence across into government departments. Many of the determinants of homelessness sit well outside the remit of the Department of Housing, wherever it sits, whatever its nomenclature in each jurisdiction. Education, health, child safety, youth justice, corrections, all of those systems. So in terms of real estate institutes, the REIQ sat on Premier's roundtable in Queensland to inform the early development of the housing plan. So I think government has a key role to step up here, and we've said in our interim report update that the Department of Housing has to have a leadership role in government. It needs ministerial mandate. It needs cabinet endorsement. It needs to be able to direct the activities of other agencies, and it needs to convene a governing body that brings the right voices to the table. That needs to be enduring, and it needs to be an empowered governance body. So I'm fully respectful of the commitment of people in this room who work in the sector. We've travelled Queensland and spoken to so many people who've worked both on the front line, the peaks, and the levels of frustration that they have shared with us around how do we get government agencies to work with us. And, you know, we're saying you have to have an accountable agency. If the response to homelessness sits in the Department of Housing, that's where it has to be. But that accountability has to be enshrined in an outcomes framework that doesn't cause people to die of exhaustion through reporting mechanisms. And we have to decide what data we actually need to make sensible investment decisions, when to get out of the way, when to repower, and hold people accountable for outcomes. And the outcomes are actually the outcomes that are achieved for people who are the most vulnerable in our community. But government agencies have to step up.
Can I just say something quickly on that? So I work for the peak body in New South Wales, or one of the peak bodies, and it's Homelessness New South Wales. And if the Real Estate Institute came to me and said, let's work together, I would say immediately, let's have a conversation about that and find ways to connect with one another. I know in New South Wales we have been thinking about ways that we could outreach to unusual allies in the sort of journey to end homelessness, and your organisation is one of them.
That's right.
Accomplices.
Come on.
So what I'd encourage you to do is to actually reach out to the peak body, the peak homelessness body in your state, and see if you can make a connection and explore where that relationship might go, because it could go somewhere very spectacular.
And lucky last, before we wrap things up.
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, thanks to the panel, very informative. Gregory Smith, Southern Cross University, lived experience. I'll keep the question very simple. We've acknowledged social movement, social perceptions and political will at the moment. My question is, what happens to all that with a change of government?
So I think that if you create a strong movement, it exists irrespective of the political party. So if we manage to get 70% of Australians saying that it's everyone's right to housing, and that everyone should have a social, the people that need it should have a social home. There's nothing that they can't do squiddly dot about it, because the public will hold them to account. And if, let's say, they try to stuff with it, if you've got a movement, you hold the political leaders to account rather than letting them go down the river and doing whatever they want to do. It's not a once-off sort of dream. So actually it does require the continual exercise of power, but if we get the public on board, it makes it very difficult for them to cast it adrift.
The only other observation I'd make is that the outcomes speak for themselves. So if you build a robust system that delivers improved outcomes, the political will is delivered. So the system has to be robust. The outcomes have to meet the needs of vulnerable people, but also meet a political need, which is a problem dealt with. So, at the end of the day, a robust system, which is based on strong mission and partnership, that delivers outcomes, great outcomes for very vulnerable people, that takes care of political will.
Thank you for that. That just leads me to wonder what governments will do with the extra money that they save from mental health, incarcerations, and the criminalisation of the poor.
Can I finish and say what they should do, Greg, is fund good organisations like Ahuri to continue to do this great work, but outlive the political cycle. So,
on that note,
yes.
On that note, please join me in thanking all of our panel members here today. A very big thank you to Dom, to Rachel, to Deb and to John. An enormous thank you to all of you for being here as well, for sticking around, because I know you've had so much to take in over the past couple of days. I really also want to thank Ahuri as well for inviting me to be here. It's been really fascinating to hear your insights and where you think this is going, and I look forward to seeing the national plan when it comes out, like all of you, and scrutinising all of it, and following Dom's cry of holding everyone to account. I'd now like to hand over to Michael Fotheringham, who's the Managing Director of Ahuri, for some final closing remarks. Thanks, Michael.
And thank you, Emma. What a tough act to follow. That panel session was just fantastic. I was thinking through that, I don't know how I'm going to follow this. And then you just got up. Making this very hard for me. I really want to thank everyone who's been involved in the conference over the last 2 days. I've really appreciated hearing from all of our speakers over 2 really packed days, and meeting many new faces and many familiar faces once again. For me, there are some really, really key takeouts from the conference that I'll very briefly speak to. The tagline for this conference was gathering momentum. And I think with our lived experience or our lived expertise, participation in the conference, I do think we're gathering momentum in that space. We had more identified lived experience speakers than the previous Australian Homelessness Conference 2 years ago, and I've come away with learnings on how we can improve further in that space. The courage, the devastating honesty of these speakers, their unforgettable personal stories will certainly stay with many of us. I'm very grateful to all of the conference participants with lived experience, whether on stage or asking great questions and in the conversations in the breaks. We heard voices that cracked but were not broken, and we'll find further ways to amplify those voices. We've continued to build the emphasis on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander challenges. Yesterday afternoon's plenary session was incredibly powerful. I know many were affected by the stories we heard. At our last big conference, the 2023 National Housing Conference, we held that in Brisbane the week before the referendum on the voice, and obviously the disappointment felt by many from the no result in that referendum. It was a huge setback. But I think with the Garma Festival this month, with the continuing efforts we've been hearing about today, I think we are gathering momentum in that space. We certainly need to. And Deb, I hear your call for accomplices. I love the word. I love the thoughts behind it. And I think we need to find ways to do that. That shifted mindset is really important. Our 2 international plenary speakers In fact, we had more than 2 international speakers. We had some great presentations from New Zealand as well that perhaps didn't get quite as much attention on the plenary stage. So our 2 North American plenary speakers showed us examples that offer inspiration, but not any delusion that the work we need to do is easy. So while I envy the bees, the billions of dollars being awarded in the US, and admire the progress being made by the Canadian Alliance, we saw that the challenges that these 2 countries face are remarkably similar to our own. With around 800 people here, there's been a great energy across both days. It's been great to see so many local governments engaging with homelessness challenges, certainly an improvement in the engagement from that sector. There's a lot they can do and a lot they need to do to really enable local responses to local issues. And speaking of alliances, the South Australian Alliance we've just heard about continues to develop. Huri ran an inquiry into homelessness service system design a few years ago, and the findings of that work were remarkably similar to the design of the South Australian system. It's a terrific example, and we'll continue to watch its evolution. This week we've considered many different angles on how we can gather momentum to end homelessness for all Australians. It's been informative, and I think it's really been inspiring. We've heard about new programs across Australia from many diverse voices, people who are changing the way we fund, deliver and coordinate homelessness services, who are forming new partnerships to address the needs of particular groups, and people who are looking at the big picture, at system changes on the whole. We've thought about our shared future and the future of our sector, of the future of vulnerable Australians, and how we can do more to build momentum. As we've heard, there's a lot more to do. I hope you've enjoyed the conference and gained as much from it as I have. I know some of you have heard me say this before, but it's genuinely important to us at Huri that you get the absolute most out of these conferences. So to do that, we really do value your feedback. I know you've all been too busy to notice just yet, but earlier this afternoon we sent you an email asking you to complete a short survey. And once I finish speaking, I'd be grateful if you could take the time to complete it and let us know your experience of the conference and what we might do to improve it. Now, some of you have been asking where the next Australian Homelessness Conference will be held. We have some exciting plans starting to take shape, but I'm not going to be making that announcement quite yet. I know many of you are also interested in the National Housing Conference, which, as some of you know, will be in Perth next October 2025. In the meanwhile, Huri will continue to publish research into housing and homelessness policy and practice, striving for better housing outcomes for all Australians. We have a number of events planned between now and the Perth conference, with some great webinars coming up over the next couple of months. I'd encourage those of you who are not already subscribers to sign up to receive our research and newsletters by visiting the Huri website and subscribing, so you don't miss out on the continuing conversations. Finally, just a few words of thanks. There are many wonderful sponsors and exhibitors who have contributed significantly to making this conference a success, so please join me in thanking them for their support one more time. Our host government partner, the Government of South Australia, also a principal partner along with Business Events Adelaide and the Adelaide Convention Centre. Our gold partner, Mission Australia, silver partner, Beyond Bank, and our bronze partners, Uniting SA and MICA Projects, and all of the session sponsors and exhibitors as well. A personal thank... There you go. And a personal thanks from me to the Huri team, Arlene, Sharon, Susanna, Ailey, Jen and Kylie. Yes, there are 2 Jens. These are huge events and they put in an enormous amount of work, and while I get a lot of the credit for it, they're the ones who do all the real work. Thank you also to the Program Advisory Committee. We had a terrific lineup of experts with a whole range of experience who helped shape this program. In particular, thank you to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Working Group and the Lived Experience Working Group that provided really specific and really useful advice shaping the conference. Lastly, thank you to all of you for making it such a great conference, such a rich set of conversations. Travel home safely. We'll see you next time.